We're bringing on Adam. Hello, Adam from England. Tell us about the contingency argument proving an eternal and omnipotent entity.
Me.
Hi.
Hello, Sofia and Jimmy. I'm a Catholic who thinks that the contingency argument by Thomas Aquinas proves the existence of an eternal, omnipotent entity.
Okay.
And
Tell me about that. I'm unfamiliar
speaking,
with the contingency argument.
okay. Well, strictly speaking, it doesn't prove the existence of a personal God, but it does prove that there's a transcendental, eternal entity that has the power of God.
How?
So the whole argument depends on this idea of contingency. And contingency is a relationship such that a contingent entity is conditionally dependent on some other entity to exist or some fact to be true. So to give an example, a flower is contingent on the existence of its environment for itself to exist, but it's also dependent on certain facts which can't go out of existence, like, for example, the gravitational constant.
Hmm.
But,
So,
what
go
the
ahead.
argument what the argument aims to show is that it's impossible that all entities are subject to contingency. So it must be the case that some entity is the terminus of all contingent entities upon which all things depend. And this makes that terminus non-contingent and eternal.
Okay, so the premise is it's sort of like the uncaused causer kind of thing, that at some point there must be a first cause. Is that sort of similar to what this contingency argument is?
It's conceptually similar, but it's not restricted to the notion of causality.
It almost sounds like it is, though, because if it's contingent upon, like, our existence would be then ultimately contingent upon the existence of God. I don't understand the difference there.
Okay. So, I mean, like I said, for example, for a flower to exist, it's dependent on certain facts that don't conceivably that don't depend on causation themselves. So, like for example, the gravitational constant. That's just like a part of the infrastructure of the world that causation itself depends on or is modified by. It could also apply to, for example, the relationship between different facts, which also aren't explicitly causal. So, like, for example, any given law of physics is contingent on certain more abstract mathematical relationships.
So
that's not a causal relationship.
Okay, so this idea that, like, but for the environment, it would be impossible to exist is not necessarily a matter of here's a chain reaction, which I see the merits of the argument kind of on its face. I can see why it's an argument that religious folks kind of respond to. I think that the way that I would look at that, though, is that, again, you end up with the problem of the uncaused causer argument and being like, we have to reach. It's a massive assumption to think that we can declare what that first being must be to cause us all to exist or to create that environment, and to assume God because we don't know better, to me, seems like a flaw. Do you have a response to
the
that
argument
one?
doesn't depend on the idea that we don't know better. All it's trying to establish is that there's a non-contingent entity, and when we look
But I
at
don't
what that
understand
means,
why we know that. That still seems like a massive assumption that's being made. It's just saying that there must be this thing, but I don't see why that's the case.
Okay. So when it comes to the property of contingency, there's only two options. So either all entities are contingent or not all entities are contingent. And what the argument does is it mounts a reductio ad absurdum against the idea that everything is contingent. What it does there is it draws an inference where if everything is contingent, then there's a condition under which all entities simultaneously don't exist. Because if each entity is contingent, then what it depends on to exist might not exist in turn, because that thing in turn is contingent, which means that the ontological series wouldn't exist.
I get that idea. I think that that's fair. But it's sort of making, again, I think we end up with a massive assumption that we can put in what that is. You know, if it's an argument that is meant to defend religion in any way or defend the idea of this higher power, we're making an assumption that the contingency is something that we can identify and work within, or that supports our idea of what a God would be. Is that not the case? Or is this sort of an assumption that this could be, you know, maybe an eternal black hole or something like that, that was the first thing? Like, again, we get into these sort of massive and strange questions. I think we also, with this one, we end up with a question of ultimate beginnings. And when we get into sort of physics and what we start to know now about space-time, things are vastly weirder than we could possibly imagine. You use the example of gravity being a constant, but it's not when we get into some really far out, strange reaches of space. And I think we're only beginning to understand how weird the universe actually is. So I guess I have two main questions here. One being, why does this argument matter in a discussion about theology or God if it's not going to declare in any way what the first contingency is, what this first thing is that would need to exist? And then second, I think we're making assumptions still about there needing to be this first contingency, which is essentially in this instance becoming the uncaused cause or the unmoved mover. Because again, you're saying there's only two options, that either nothing ever starts to exist so it doesn't exist, or things start to exist so they do exist, therefore there must be a first contingency, when maybe things always existed. Like, time is much weirder than we think. So I guess those are sort of two issues I have with this. Jimmy Jr., I know you haven't actually mentioned anything else, so if there's anything you want to throw in.
Yeah, I actually do want to take a look at the contingency argument from the flip side of what the caller is presenting. Have we ever considered, or Adam, have you ever considered that maybe God, maybe deities, or are contingent upon the existence of humans, and maybe not the other way around? All these assumptions that we have to make leave us with kind of a lot of blank spaces, right? The God of the gaps argument. So we don't really know how we got here, or what we got here, or what got us here, or even what we're contingent upon, right? Are we even necessary? The contingency argument also talks about things being necessary, and therefore, because everything can't be necessary, everything must be contingent. But I mean, what if, we kind of turn it around and say, okay, we know that humans exist, and we know that stories about God exist. Why not take a look at it from the flip side and say, actually, the only way that God even comes in is because its existence is contingent upon the existence of humans. And you can back that up just like you can with the flower. Gravity exists first, right? And I know that you weren't going in a chain reaction sort of way, but let's just look at it that way. Gravity is just as responsible for that flower as gravity is responsible for the development and stories of God, and whatever else, whatever supernatural things we can't prove that we kind of posit into our story. It's just as contingent or just as responsible for those things. And I kind of want to say, or want to see what you think about my argument there.
Okay. So first I'll respond to what Sofia said about this idea of how do we identify God from the argument. Well, if the conclusion of the argument is that something is eternal and omnipotent, well, omnipotence is something that only God has. And
so that right there,
omnipotent.
Sorry. But we gotta, yeah, so that right there is a claim in itself that, again, it's taking the burden of proof and just kind of casting it into this shadow area, right? So you're using this idea that only God is omnipotent. Well, how do we know that? How, if that is necessary to make your argument, then we have to stop there and investigate that step, because we can't move any further. You've just inserted something new, right? It's like writing a research paper. You don't just get to the conclusion and start dumping new facts in, right? And that's kind of what you're doing. So now you have mentioned that only God is omnipotent. Well, we haven't yet gotten to the idea that we know God is even there, but you're ascribing characteristics to it. And so we have to investigate that. So now we have this thing that you're saying is there, but we really don't know, but you have an argument to show how it's there. But first, here's this characteristic about it. So now how do you know that only God is omnipotent?
I think there's a misunderstanding. When I say that only God is omnipotent, I actually just mean the term God. So the question that Sophia was asked about was about identifiability. So what I'm just saying is that.
But now we still have.
Establishes that.
Sorry, go ahead. If the argument establishes omnipotence, I would argue that we haven't gotten there. That the question still stands because you're saying like, I'm assuming this argument proves, which I don't think we have conceded at any point, but assuming this argument proves that there must be some first contingency, I have no idea why that would lead us to think that it must be omnipotent. And that's a jump that I think was made. And I think that's what Jimmy's referring to, that we didn't get there. We have not established God's omnipotence. We haven't established that the first thing would need to be any kind of God, omnipotent or otherwise. So I think that's, more of what the question is. We have a comment in here that someone mentioned, it could only be sufficiently capable. Like whatever thing is the first contingency would have to be, thank you, host, sufficiently capable of being the first contingency. It doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be omnipotent. How did we end up there?
Okay, well, so to just kind of like finish off my answer to your first question about identifiability, all I meant to say is that when we talk about God, we're talking about something which is eternal and omnipotent. So my answer to your question is just that putting objections about it aside for a second, if the argument establishes something is eternal and omnipotent, that's just how it contributes towards our understanding of God. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, I feel like it's really easy to be right if you just say putting aside objections before you answer the question.
And then why are we putting an if? I mean, your argument is contingent upon your proof of the contingency argument, right? If we have to put an if down and then grant you some territory in your argument to say, all right, we can give you these things so that you can make your argument. Well, why should we have to give you anything? Why can't you just make the argument without us first having to make concessions? This is what happens whenever we have this conversation. You know, it's one of these things where people have to say, well, let's just assume God is real for a second. And then they list their argument. Well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to say, well, if X, Y, and Z, then, you know, Bravo or B or whatever. If ABC, then D. So why do you need to kind of make that concession in the beginning? Why can't you just lay out the argument?
Well, I think that's kind of stepping outside the bounds of Sophia's question, because what Sophia's question was about identifiability. Me demonstrating what the use of the argument is. So of course, if I answer, I'm telling you if the argument is correct. I'm telling you what use it is. That's all I'm.
Except it doesn't make that jump. So it doesn't. So I would say that even within the bounds of my question, it's not satisfying, because when I think about like, all right, what is the use here of this argument? You're saying that it would be that God would have to be, or that the thing would have to be omnipotent. And that seems like a massive jump. That doesn't seem like it makes it a very useful argument to me, because, even within the bounds of this question, if I were sitting in youth group and somebody was telling this to me, I would think, well, how did we get there? Like, it would be the same question. And if the expectation is that I just continue to say, okay, well, if I grant this, then maybe it's true. And if I grant this, then maybe it's true. Or I'll continue along with this argument without stopping and saying, I don't understand this leap we made. Then pretty soon we're pretty deep into this religious road where I've just granted a lot because why? Because there's sort of this desire to keep believing is really all I'm getting here.
And I just want to say something. I'm sorry, Adam. So I understand that for the purposes of this call or this conversation, you're defining God as like, this maybe this first being or this first step, and you're not really ascribing Christian values to it. But you did say that you were a Catholic, and so and I speak for myself, not Sofia, but it's kind of hard for me to separate the idea that you're thinking maybe about a specific God. I just want to kind of throw that out there. That muddies the waters a little bit as well. But I'm going to let you continue. Sorry.
Okay. So from what I remember, there was 2 questions that Jimmy asked me, and there was still a couple things that Sofia said before. One of the said that Sofia said was something like, what if it's all eternal? But of course, the argument concludes that something is eternal, right?
Does it?
And
I mean, it just says that thing must exist. Doesn't really specify. Why must the first thing be eternal?
Exactly what you said. Well, you said something about what if everything is contingent, and then you said something like it could just be that everything's eternal. But what I'm saying is that this wouldn't disagree with the argument. It wouldn't disagree with the conclusion of the argument.
Okay. Well, how not when there's supposed to be a first contingency?
Pardon me?
Anyway, sorry, continue. I feel like that's another area where I'm like, I'm supposing, I suppose, let me clarify, that if we're supposing God is eternal and God is the first contingency, which seems to be where this argument wants to lead, I would just say, why not have endless contingencies forever? Like, I don't understand how one makes more logical sense than the other.
Okay, yeah, that was it. And so it was the thing about what you said about God being the first contingency that I want to respond to. Of course, the conclusion of the argument is that God is non-contingent. So when we look at what the consequences are of an ontological series, in which every single member is contingent, we see that leads to a contradiction with just the fact that stuff exists. Because
again, I don't think that it does.
That's assuming God is real. That is assuming that God is the first step in this story that we're trying to tell, and it's assuming that God is there without having to prove it, and then saying, well, God's not contingent on everything else that comes later. That's all contingent upon God. That's the way I'm understanding.
I think, may I mention too, like, I feel like this is a really interesting argument. I feel like you seem like someone who's like a serious thinker, and I really appreciate that. I think we've gotten to a point where we're kind of going around and around a little bit. But I feel like we've kind of given you a few questions that, to be honest, I would love answered, and I would love if you called back and looked at it, because I think we're kind of hitting the same things again and again. We do have other callers that I think might be worth moving on to, but I do want to give you kind of a last word here, Adam. And thank you for calling, because it's super interesting. But I think we've kind of hit maybe what we're going to hit today, if that makes sense.
So Sofia, if I may, first of all, Adam, I love this conversation, man. This is great. I am of the mindset that we're not gaining any ground here, but I do want to. It is a good segue because, we've kind of just concluded, if you will, that we're at this point where God is not contingent upon anything, and that actually answers the question that I wanted answered. So if you could just maybe tackle that. Have you ever considered that because we can't prove God, maybe that human beings are responsible for God, and God is contingent upon us?
Okay, yeah, that was one of the questions that you asked before. I would just say that, well, the argument is meant to talk about an objective reality. So obviously we have a subjective compartment of our thought, and we also have an objective. We can also understand the objective world. The argument refers to the objective world. So what it's designed to establish is what is true about the objective world. And so the presupposition that God is like a fiction or a social construct wouldn't rebut the argument. I mean, it's an interesting idea that we might kind of be bringing a kind of pseudo God into existence by imagining it. But I don't hold that view.
So obviously, I appreciate that response. So what I want to say is, I'm gonna say something, and then I'm gonna make an appointment with you, okay? Because I have a great proposition for you. So, first of all, I think that God is just a way that humans have ordered society. Okay, religion has been used to order society, to create some kind of hierarchy, to create conditions to which everybody can cooperate and ensure the survivability. Now, cooperate is a term that is subjective, of course, because some people are forced to cooperate. We have slaves, we have concubines, we have prisoners, etc. And then some people are at the top of those hierarchies. In other societies, maybe it's a little bit more communal. Maybe people are cooperating a little bit more willingly, and we have different ways that happens. We've got different kinds of governments, whether it's capitalist or socialist, etc. There are ways that humans organize, and we organize to keep things in order so that we all know that we have a role to ensure the survivability of the greater good. And in my opinion, God is just one of those things. That is why God has popped up in many societies, many civilizations. And it's why that civilizations borrow these concepts of God. If you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh versus some of the stories in the New Testament, or maybe the creation story in the Hindu Veda, which I recently read, which I thought was fascinatingly close to or not creation of man, but maybe of the beginning. In the beginning, there was water covered the face of the deep, et cetera, et cetera. That is strikingly similar to Genesis. In any case, you can find this all across the board. And what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to ordering society, God is just one of those ways that we did it that really isn't applicable anymore. Now, I do want to put a pin in that, if I may, and I don't mean to just dump all of this information on you and then just ask you to go away, because I know that Richard Gilliver, one of our hosts here at Talk Heathen, would have loved to take this call with you. As a matter of fact, he sent us a message and said, "Hey, can you have him call back when I'm on?" Which is on February 25th, which is when I'm on. So I will be on with Richard on February 25th, and you have now got several weeks to kind of look up and look into everything I just said, and get back. And Richard could probably kind of give you a more pointed conversation that you're looking for, maybe, than I can. I thought Sofia did great. So I wanted to kind of leave you with that.
Okay, but what would I be arguing if I called?
You can posit the same claim that you just posited, and Richard can respond to it as far as the contingency argument. And if you have anything that you'd like to add about me thinking that God is fictional because it comes from the human need to survive and organize society, well, you're more than welcome to address me on that.
I would also say, put in there that my background as a middle school teacher makes me feel like, I'm clearly a layperson. I don't do a ton of formal logic work. That there are places where we pointed out that you were sort of losing us or making a jump that we don't make with you. I think that would be a place maybe to look at your argument, because I'd be really curious to see what is there, that might be a place to look at in the next few weeks. But yeah, just to emphasize, Richard has been in the chat oh man, I really want to talk to this guy. So you're wanted, I guess.
All right.
That's true.
Well, thank you very much for calling.